Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Friday with virtual AP U.S. history. We're back once again. 11 o'clock is our magic hour. Wanted to do a few shout outs from yesterday. We didn't quite get onto the program. Mr. Wilson from Hawaii, Lori Buck from ADMH, who is, according to this student, one of the smartest and most compassionate teachers. Mr. Markham from Panther Creek High School. Todd Hutchins, Bay City Western, Ms. Tram from Long Beach Polytechnical, Mr. Lee from Seneca Valley, Ms. Fawnin from Summit K through 12, Ms. Prada from NPHS, who the student describes as tough but fair, makes history fun. Jim Morrison from Red Wing High in Minnesota, Mr. Button from Thompson High, and Mr. Weiser from Hanford West. So little shout out to those teachers and to those classes. Thanks to those students for reaching out and for getting a little shout out for their teacher. I'm Mr. Horton from Williamsville South High School in Williamsville, New York. Our school mascot is the Billy Goat, so we often say horns up. So horns up for the end of the week here on a Friday. So today we're going to start out with what information I think a lot of people are looking for is some information on the U.S. history exam for 2020, a little update on what's going to be on here. So here's some information for you. The exam will be Friday, May the 15th. So that is a week beyond what the original test date was going to be at 2 o'clock Eastern time. So whatever time zone you're in, it obviously will be scaled for that. So the exam is Friday, May the 15th. Of course, all the exams are going to be online and they will not last more than 45 minutes. So the format of the exam, the $1 million question that we've been getting on Twitter, is a modified DBQ. So you've been working on DBQ skills all school year long. You've been looking at primary source documents. You've been sourcing documents. You've been building arguments using documents, and that's what they're going to test with the DBQ. Obviously, a reduced number of documents here. Normally we have 7. Instead, the number of documents now will be 5 for this year's exam only, focusing on what they typically call the core periods minus period 8. So periods 3 through 7. And we're going to begin reviewing the course starting on Monday, April the 13th. So make sure you tune in then, as we'll begin the process of starting from the very beginning and going over all the material that AP U.S. history covers. But the DBQ on the exam will only cover periods 3, which starts in 1754 and goes all the way through the end of period 7, which is 1945. One of the things that I was really excited to hear is that teachers will get a copy of all student responses. So I'll be able to see what my students wrote on the exam, just like your teachers will have the opportunity to see what you wrote on the exam. It'll be an interesting process for an opportunity for teachers to review that with you. The rubric for this, at this point, I don't want to talk too much in detail about that, but it's basically the same rubric with a few adaptations, obviously because of the time change or the time requirement change that's there, but it's essentially the same skills, all the skills that Ms. Farr and I have been working on over the course of the last week and a half that we've been doing this and will continue to do. By the way, she's on Twitter this morning, so if you have questions, please feel free to tweet them to @virtualapush, and she'll be answering those while we go through the next phase here of period 8. So the review question from yesterday, as you can see here, the document is a document from Lewis Powell, and the question was, what is this person's point of view about the changes of the 1960s? So Ms. Farr did a really great job yesterday, I think, in covering a lot of those movements that were happening in America, the Great Society changes, trying to make America a better place, to improve poverty, the civil rights extensions that she talked about yesterday, like the women's rights movement and the gay rights movement, the feminist movement. This person, though, has a little different point of view about that, and it really sets up what we're going to talk about and deal with today. So this person's point of view about those changes is that these are not positive changes, and they're concerned about what's happening. And really, that's the subject of the day today, is to look at what's going on there. So a quick review. quick recap. I always in my classes, I talk about the progressive, what a progressive person believes. And generally speaking, progressives believe that government power should be used to solve social and economic problems. So if you remember back to Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, they were people that were advocating that the national government get involved in, and in some cases, state governments get involved in regulating the economy and helping people. Ms. Farr talked yesterday about the New Deal, which is a great example of a progressive or liberal program where government power should be used to solve social and economic problems. Things like the FDIC and the Social Security Administration, just to name two, as examples of that. And then, of course, the Great Society is another example of a liberal or progressive program. But the other side of the story is the conservative side, and that is conservatives believe that people should solve their own social and economic problems without government. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today or deal with is conservatism and the rise of conservatism, sort of a reaction against many of those changes of the 1960s. That'll be our focus for the day. So a quick film clip to get us started here on the environmental movement.
On June 16, 1962, as the elements of Silent Spring were being prepared for publication, the first New Yorker installment arrived on the newsstands, and with its opening paragraphs, lured readers into a fertile world of plenty.
There was once a town in the heart of America where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. The town lay in the midst of a checkerboard of prosperous farms with fields of grain and hillsides of orchards, where in spring, white clouds of bloom drifted above the green fields.
The birds sing and the woods are filled with living things, and it's an abundant, happy place. And then suddenly the residents discover the birds are gone and the animals have died and many of the plants have withered.
People start to get sick for reasons that can't be explained. Livestock have stunted offspring. Everything goes bad.
In the gutters under the eaves and between the shingles of the roofs, a few patches of white granular powder could be seen. Some weeks earlier, this powder had been dropped like snow upon the roofs and the lawns, the fields and the streams. No witchcraft, no enemy action had snuffed out life in this stricken world. The people had done it themselves.
She creates an image of silence. What would it be like if you woke up in the morning and you went outside and instead of hearing birds chirp or sing, you heard nothing? And that's just so amazingly powerful, right? And it just, it stops you in your tracks.
In the zealous quest for mastery, Carson argued, synthetic pesticides had been used indiscriminately, excessively, heedlessly, upsetting the delicate balance of nature and putting all life at risk.
She felt that proponents of widespread pesticide use were conducting an experiment with life itself without having done adequate testing or research to determine what the consequences might be, and that the citizenry weren't being informed because the proponents of pesticides were telling them only one side of the story and the one that benefited their own interest. And so all of these things are part of the Cold War consensus by which Americans lived. The benevolence of corporations, the authority of science. Well, Carson's challenging all of those things.
Okay, so something for us to think about, a connection back to the progressive era. Theodore Roosevelt, one of his great contributions to the United States was an emphasis on conservation and the government stepping in as a good progressive would to solve social and economic problems here. So there was a series of laws passed in the early 1970s, including Earth Day demonstrations, which led the president to support Earth Week the following year in 1971. The Clean Air Act is signed in 1970, which tried to regulate and clean up air pollution. The creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, a government agency dedicated to trying to clean up the environment and to protect the environment. So a quick question here, I won't put the timer on, but do you think a conservative president would support these things, or a liberal president or progressive president? So remember, progressives believe in using the power of the national government to solve social and economic problems, and conservatives believe that people should solve social and economic problems. So hopefully you're realizing, I almost gave the answer away there, that these government actions are really good examples of progressive or liberal things. But what you might be surprised to find out is that Richard Nixon, who is often considered to be a conservative president, passed these laws. And one of the things you'll notice as we complete the course here is that it's not always clear. Presidents that are conservative do some liberal things, and presidents that are liberal do some conservative things. So you'll see that there's a little bit of inconsistency sometimes with some of the folks that are here. So I'll take just a minute to read through the document from Richard Nixon about national energy policy there, and consider how it might be connected to what you see in the graph. So on the left-hand side in that speech that Nixon is giving there, he's talking about an energy crisis, and you notice that they're trying to close down gasoline stations to limit people's consumption of that, and creating a maximum speed limit. And he talks about energy independence by 1980 at the end there. And hopefully you recognize that the connection between that statement in November of 1973 and the chart that you see there is the United States is forced increasingly to import oil, and that will be an important theme really for the rest of period 8 and into period 9, the need for that raw material and how that will affect American policy and policy decisions that you'll see here. So clearly the United States is more and more reliant on other places for oil, which is a problem that Nixon is trying to address in this statement here. So lesson overview, we're going to talk about the environment, which we kind of reviewed at the beginning here. And more importantly, the main focus is 8.14, society and transition, the change away from the 1960s, heading into the final period of the course, which we'll get into next week. The skill is building an argument, which you'll find, I think, very much ties in with what the exam is going to be. I'm going to focus on DBQ type skills today to kind of get you ready for that. Things you should already know. The topic, obviously, from yesterday, which is liberalism, which reached a peak in the mid-1960s. Ms. Farr talked about the Great Society programs being an example of liberalism, the Supreme Court decisions, which are examples of liberalism, protecting individual rights at the expense of the national government with things like the Miranda case and the Gideon case, the Brown versus Board case, etc. So the overriding question is, why did this happen? Why did conservatism rise in the 1970s? And hopefully you'll understand some of the reasons for that. America becomes more conservative for many reasons, and we're going to talk about some of those a little bit. And the first one is the loss in faith in the federal government. So one of the big events that happens early in the 1970s is the Watergate Scandal, and I'm doing a very, very summary version of the story here. So there's a burglary at the Watergate Hotel, which was the headquarters of the Democratic National Party in 1972. It seemed like a minor story. In fact, the two reporters that were assigned to report on it were basically beat reporters. They reported on small local crimes, and they end up getting embroiled in this whole thing. So the two Washington Post reporters are Woodward and Bernstein, very famous names sort of connected to the Watergate scandal. And the reason that they're famous is that they continued to write about the story story and investigate the story. And the more they peeled back the layers here, the deeper elements of the federal government were implicated in that. And more people eventually ended up testifying, and many of them went to jail as a result of their involvement in Watergate. So eventually, as it says in the first bullet point there, eventually there was a connection to White House characters, which is part of the story. The two reporters are aided by an unofficial source. One of the great political mysteries of the late 20th century was who in fact was this Deep Throat, which was their code name for that source who was guiding the two reporters and giving them inside information to help them in their investigation. Eventually, Congress begins their own investigation of what was happening in Watergate, much like what we saw with President Trump. We saw in the impeachment proceeding of President Trump a lot of echoes of the things that were happening in Watergate, where there's investigations and questions about the actions of what the president knows and what the president does not know. And eventually, it was revealed that Nixon was actually taping conversations in the White House. And once that fact became known, then there became a battle over turning over those tapes to the investigators. So the Robert Mueller of the Watergate scandal, which was Archibald Cox. So eventually they are turned over. One of the tapes has a mysterious gap in the conversation, about 18.5 minutes long. And that's what the cartoon is referring to here that you can see on the right-hand side. There's a little piece of the tape that's missing, and very creatively, the cartoonist is taking this famous statement from Nixon, "I am not a crook," and removing the little segment that says "not," which of course leads us to imply that Nixon in fact was a crook, which is what the cartoonist is trying to say. Tell us here. Eventually, there is a smoking gun tape that is revealed, and it's very obvious that the president is talking about ways to cover up the Watergate burglary, which he had claimed he had no knowledge of. The cover up for a long period of time. So a very quick version of the story there. Typically, this might be a class period in your normal classes. If you're interested in more details about that, I think you'll find this to be interesting, being that you've lived through the impeachment process in your own lives. Just give you a second here to scan the QR code. And this will take you to a really great video that kind of breaks the story down and gives you the a little bit more detail about this so you can understand it a little bit more in depth than what I've explained here in about 2.5 minutes. So Watergate, what does this have to do with conservatism? Well, one of the things that happens is people begin to lose faith in the federal government. The government had lied about Vietnam and what they claimed was progress in that war. And of course, the Tet Offensive showed that that wasn't really what was happening. And then Watergate, which causes people to lose further faith in what their federal government was telling them. Economic problems in the 1970s as well. Inflation is a big problem throughout much of the decade, 13% alone in 1979. The cost of foreign oil actually increases, and especially after what was called the Arab oil embargo in 1973. Countries around the world were angry at the United States for backing Israel in the Yom Kippur War, and they initiated an embargo against the U.S. So you see in the image here a line of cars waiting to try to get gasoline. So the cost of gasoline, of course, goes up, and that will cause problems. Economic problems for the U.S., huge deficits and high interest rates, especially the interest rates. If you're familiar with some economics here, it makes it more difficult for people to borrow money. It makes them less likely to borrow money. And in 1979, President Carter retreated to Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland, and consulted with over 100 leaders, came back from that meeting and gave a speech that basically, it's known now as the crisis and confidence speech, where he attributed all the problems in America to a lack of faith in our system. So all these things together are issues that the federal government seemed unable to solve. We couldn't bring inflation down. We couldn't effectively deal with the foreign oil dependency that we had. We couldn't bring down interest rates. And then the president goes on television and tells us that we just don't have enough faith. And that's the reason why things aren't happening well here, which does not go over well with a lot of people in the United States. And then Carter deals with a very serious foreign policy event, and we're going to show you a quick clip to tell that story.
In the fall of 1979, protesters broke into the American embassy in Iran, took dozens of people hostage, and kept them there for a long, long time. This was the Iran hostage crisis, an episode that changed the course of American history. Let's take a step back. This hostage crisis didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of several decades of bad blood between the United States and Iran. In 1953, the U.S. helped topple Iran's elected prime minister, replacing him with Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, also known as simply the Shah. The Shah was friendly to the U.S. interests, particularly when it came to oil. The Shah was about as popular in Iran as ants at a picnic. He was a brutal dictator, and his infamous secret police, the Savak, terrorized, tortured, and killed people. Opposition to the Shah grew and grew. In January of 1979, he and his family left Iran on vacation, never to return. By the spring of that year, a religious leader, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, took power. This is the Iranian Revolution. Khomeini established a new government, an Islamic Republic. This new government, and the young masses who supported it, had no love for the United States. They staged demonstrations outside the U.S. Embassy in the Iranian capital of Tehran. Trouble was brewing. After leaving Iran, the Shah bounced around from country to country, but after a cancer diagnosis, he wanted to come to the United States to receive the best medical care. President Jimmy Carter didn't want to admit the Shah, but relented under pressure from a group of elder statesmen led by Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller. The Shah arrived at the New York hospital on October 22, 1979. As Carter predicted, giving shelter to the Shah angered the Iranian revolutionaries. A lot. So much so that on November 4th, 1979, a huge mob of protesters attacked the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Knock, knock. Who's there? 3,000 of us, and we're mad as hell. The mob took 63 people at the embassy prisoner. Later, 3 more people were taken hostage at the Iranian Foreign Ministry, bringing the total to 66. 13 days later, the Ayatollah ordered the release of 13 hostages, leaving 53. Another hostage was subsequently released on medical grounds. From then on, the remaining 52 were there for the long haul. They were held in the same embassy complex where they'd once worked. No hostages were killed, but they weren't treated well either. Some were beaten with rubber hoses or hung over elevator shafts. Several men were even victims of a mock execution. Back in the States, the hostage crisis gripped the news cycle.
Iranian militants seized the American embassy in Iran.
The American government demanded the hostages' release, but were rebuffed. The Iranians wanted the Shah shipped to them. No, said the U.S. To drive the point home, the U.S. froze Iranian assets held in American banks. But still, the Iranians didn't budge. In April of 1980, President Carter decided to try something different. He authorized a military rescue mission known as Operation Eagle Claw. But poor weather and mechanical failures doomed the mission, leaving America and the Carter administration embarrassed on the world stage. Carter was in an election year, and his opponent, Ronald Reagan, pounced on him for being weak and ineffective.
Frankly, I don't think the president has done anything that he couldn't have done 5 months ago.
When Election Day rolled around, the hostages were still being held captive with no end in sight. Reagan trounced Carter at the polls. By the start of 1981, the Iranian government began to feel the pressure from the international community to release the hostages. The Iranians and Americans went back to the bargaining table. In exchange for lifting the embargo, Iran agreed to release their prisoners. Just hours after Ronald Reagan took the oath of office on January 20th, 1981, the American hostages were freed from captivity. The hostage crisis lasted 444 days. It was a bruising period for the United States and for President Carter. And the ugly mark it left on relations between the United States and Iran lingers to this day.
So there's a great little image there right towards the end of that video. The U.S. cannot do anything. And so that's really the feeling of a lot of people in the United States, that things just were not going well. There's a loss in Vietnam. There's the oil crisis. There is inflation that seems out of control. And then the Iran hostage crisis, which, of course, the president attempts to do a rescue mission, and even that fails. So things were not going well for much of the United States. And that's why one of the reasons why conservatism grows. Government officials not telling the truth, seeming inability to deal with economic issues, as I mentioned here in the second bullet points, kind of recapping the first part of this here, perceived failures of Jimmy Carter, the Iran hostage crisis and failed rescue attempt, the crisis of confidence speech that I mentioned just a few moments ago. And Carter is probably one of the most well-known people for doing much more good after his presidency. In fact, even to this day, he builds houses for Habitat for Humanity. So, but not during his presidency in the 1970s. People viewed him as a failure, certainly. And that's why this was such a big deal.
The puck is still loose. 11 seconds. You've got 10 seconds. The countdown going on right now. Morrow up to Schultz. 5 seconds left in the game. Do you believe in miracles? Yes! Unbelievable.
So in the 1980 Olympics, if you're not familiar with that story, and I'm a hockey coach, so that's part of the reason why I like to just include this briefly. The United States hockey team defeated a Soviet team that seemed completely invincible. So it was a small victory after all those negative things that had happened in the 1970s. So we're going to just do a quick shout out to student viewers from all week long. Zane from Richmond, Missouri, Cody from Enloe, Rushi from Winston Churchill High School, Threezy Ortega United High School, Harsh D. Banga from West Hill High School, Eva from Barnstable High School in Massachusetts, Denise Lopez from Hover High School, Alexandra Rundgren from Severna Park High School, Edra Timmerman from Howell High School, Natasha Romero from Freeman High School, and Ms. Constance Hines from Alonzo High School. Thank you all for tuning in every day at 11 o'clock. We really appreciate that. Hopefully you spread the word about what we're trying to accomplish here. So thank you again to all those students. We'll get to some teacher shout outs at the end here. So what we're gonna work on now is a DBQ to help you with that process of looking at documents, interpreting documents. And as we do this, I want you to think about there's 6 documents to practice here. This is from a DBQ from an earlier exam. And as you look at these, think about what the document would offer as an answer to the question, why did conservatism rise? So here's the first one, a little quote from Barry Goldwater. We'll start the timer. All right, so again, the question is to think about what would Goldwater's answer be to why conservatism rose, or what does this document tell us about the story about conservatism rising in the United States? Barry Goldwater eventually would run against President Johnson in 1964, and he is often considered to be the founding father of the modern conservative movement. So what does this document tell us? There's a picture of Goldwater there on the right-hand side. So I highlighted one of the key quotes here. The root evil is a government is engaged in activities in which it has no legitimate business. So the translation for that is that government is far too involved in our lives and is spending too much money. He believes the national government has overreached its authority and is engaging in things that it really shouldn't be engaging in. So I'm going to ask you a quick little connections question here, and we'll let Ms. Farr decide whether you're right or wrong about this. The 2 original political parties in the United States were the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. Which of those 2 parties do you think that Goldwater sounds more like? So once again, Goldwater is saying here, the national government is far too strong, it's far too involved in our lives and is spending too much money and it needs to back off. So was it the Federalists or the Jeffersonian Republicans that you think? Make a little connection here for you back to an earlier period in history. So one reason why conservatism rises, too much power of the national government, according to this. So let's go on to document number 2. We'll start the timer here for you on that. Okay, so hopefully when you read through this document, you notice that the word reforms is in quotations, so you have to read that a little different. Which of any of the great reforms of past decades has achieved its objectives might be one way of reading that. So what is this person telling us? He's an economist, Milton Friedman, and a simple translation here is that government programs, the New Deal, the Great Society, which is hasn't quite happened yet, but he certainly would criticize those for the same reason, have not helped us progress. Individuals in a laissez-faire system have. So he talks about this at the very bottom of that document. All this has been the product of the initiative and drive of individuals. So this is outlining a very distinct economic view of conservatives, that people should be doing these things and making advances in the economy and not government programs. That's essentially what this person is saying to us here. All right, this one's a little shorter and this one's a great document. All right, and time's up there. So this is when my students typically read this document, when I've gone over it with them in the past, they really love that last line about the typewriter being stolen. But what does this tell us about conservatism? That's the question that we're really after here, why conservatism rose. So this woman is a quick translation of that document. She's a hardworking person that government is not really helping, according to her, that everybody else is getting assistance except for her. She refers to herself as a law-abiding citizen who feels she's discriminated against. I'm a widow, I work every day, I pay my taxes, but I can't even walk on the streets because they're unsafe and I'm afraid in my own home, as she says here. So then of course this great line at the bottom, sorry, this letter is not typed, somebody stole my typewriter. So, but you have here a person that feels like government programs have not benefited her. And so this is another reason why conservatism rose. Let's try the next document, document 4. And time's up there. So as you read through this document, this is from a television evangelist. So obviously he's a religious leader that you see here. And to translate this document, he actually gives us lots of different things here. Children are moving away from traditional values as sort of the overarching connection between most of the points that he makes here. Television is teaching kids immorality. Children are disrespecting their family. Public schools are excluding prayer. If you think about the Engel versus Vitale case that was reviewed yesterday, that's probably what he's referring to here. The drug culture of the late 1960s and early 70s. Government is teaching kids to be lazy. So he's got all kinds of criticisms here that television and culture is moving in a non-traditional way, which is what he's suggesting. So another reason that conservatism rose is this social concern about the direction of American culture, the perceived casualness and disregard for tradition that many people were sensing in the early 1970s. And some students recognize this sort of irony of someone that uses television to spread their message at the same time he's complaining about television doing immoral things for our culture and society here. So, so this is more of a social or cultural point of view on things. Let's try the 5th document. So here you have the Republican Party platform in 1980, which of course they're running against Jimmy Carter, and hopefully you recognize the reference that's being made here in the document, where they're talking about the insults that the United States has faced, our embassies being burned. Hopefully that evoked images of the Iran hostage crisis from the clip that I showed you just a few minutes ago here. So the translation here, a very simple translation: America's lost international respect. President Carter has only made it worse. He hasn't done a whole lot. The invasion of Afghanistan here at the bottom, by the way, was an invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets that the United States also does not really respond very strongly to, which is another reason that they're criticizing Carter here. It's not the invasion of Afghanistan that's carried out by the U.S. in 2001, and we'll talk about that a little bit next week. So some students make that unfortunately they make that connection, which isn't an accurate connection. So this is the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets in 1979 that they're referring to here. So a sense that America has sort of lost its prestige or power in the world is what this person is suggesting is another reason why conservatism rose. So now we have 5 reasons just from these documents alone to help answer our question. And our last document for today, let's start the timer on this one. Okay, so here you have a member of a group called Stop ERA, and the Equal Rights Amendment is what that refers to, of course. So here you have a woman that is opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment, and she's saying that women don't need to be liberated from the home. The home is what they love, and that they need to be actually liberated from the liberators. So this is a woman that is reacting or responding to the women's rights movement in the opposite way of what we would assume, that not all, in other words, not all women supported the Equal Rights Amendment, and she is standing up for a more traditional role for women. We believe that mothers must stand up for the protection of our homes and children, she says in the last part of the document here. So again, sort of a social cultural reason here. So here's the stem of the question. We spent a little bit of time looking at 6 or 7 different answers here. So the question asked, explain the reasons why a new conservatism rose to prominence in the United States between 1960 and 1989. Now, granted, we haven't gone as late as 1989 in the documents here, but we can still deal with this question. So take a minute and see what would your preliminary thesis for this question be? How might you start approaching this question? So hopefully you were thinking about some of the things that we've covered in the course of today's video. So remember a couple things. Make sure that your claim is defensible. It has to be historically defensible. So there's lots of reasons that we've covered in the video today. Reaction against big government, which we heard from Barry Goldwater, and opposition to the women's movement, which was the last document that we looked at, and the rise of religious groups and people that were concerned about the lack of religion or the perceived casualness of American culture. Belief in free market economics, we saw a document about that. Desire to return to more traditional values, we saw a document about that as well. A more sophisticated thesis might indicate which of these factors was more important versus less important. So if you want to go to the next level with your thesis statement, that might be something to think about here, maybe ranking them and saying this was the most important reason why conservatism rose in this period. Remember, don't do this. These are the don'ts on a thesis statement. Do not fail to make a claim. Do not fail to give reasons why conservatism rose. That's what the question's asking. And definitely don't restate the prompt. For a quick example of that, conservatism rose in the period. That's what the prompt tells us. So they're asking you to explain why that happened. So make sure that you do that. So this is a couple of examples of acceptable thesis statements. Notice what this first student does. The most important factors that contributed to the birth of new conservatism were desire for more reliance on free market capitalism, a society oriented towards traditional morals and values, and a government that was strong on both foreign and domestic policy. Great thesis statement there, outlining the three directions that probably the essay is going to go. The second student also does this. The three more important causes were the left activist influence on politics, the breakup of the traditional family, and the effects of the counterculture within society. Therefore, resulted from a desire for a return to structure and order, sort of framing all of those things together here. Both really nice thesis statements, setting up what should be really good essays if they follow through. And again, I think you know what an unacceptable thesis is at this point, but we kind of hit a couple of those, so no need to really talk too much about that. Now, a second thing to think about is contextualization. What is the background information if we want to simplify this a little bit? And of course, we have to connect to the question. So give you about 40 seconds to think about that. All right, so contextualization is, again, we're trying to set the frame for the question. Where does it belong in history? So hopefully you're thinking about some of the things really that were covered yesterday. Reactions against the movements of the 60s. People were concerned about the hippies and the counterculture and the rise of drugs and the sexual revolution. Concerns about the Cold War and where the United States stood in the world in the 1970s especially. There were people that were worried about the overreach in their view of the federal government and things like the New Deal and Great Society programs. So these are all the 1960s things are kind of background or setting up where this stuff comes from, the rise of conservative thinking in the 1970s. So complexity is the last piece that we'll talk about here, and then we'll get into a quick wrap up for today. So complexity is, again, another point on the rubric. Can you corroborate, qualify, or modify the argument? This is taking the argument to the next level. So a corroborate version of this might be giving evidence from different themes, from different perspectives, or from different regions of the world, or different regions of the country, if you could identify those. So that might be one way to do that, and we'll revisit this topic for sure down the road. Qualify is another way to do a more complex essay, giving multiple ways conservatism rose, explain why some are more important than others might be a way of approaching that. And actually a couple of those thesis statements we looked at had a little example of that in it, or give ways that conservatism did not rise. In other words, the other side of the story in this sense. So we're talking about conservatism became more popular, but here are ways that it did not become more popular, is qualifying that argument. Or modifying the prompt, which is making a slight change in that. And the danger here is that you don't want to get too far off topic. The question is asking about why conservatism rose, so make sure your essay focuses on that. But you could make the argument that conservatism didn't really rise in the 1970s, and maybe give some examples of that, or that its rise wasn't as important as maybe some other developments in that period. But again, make sure that you are answering the prompt that they ask you. That's an important piece of that story. Again, we'll come back to this one a little bit later down the road. You know, the College Board's also put together a video that helps to explain complexity that should be coming out for you fairly soon. So a quick check for understanding. So here's a historian that's provided an answer to why conservatism rose. So we'll just give you a little bit of time here to read that, and then we'll see what you think about the answer to this question. So some of the things that this historian cites: opposition to the feminist and gay rights movements, those social movements of the late 60s, early 70s, the support for school prayer, the need for increased defense spending, the sense that the United States has sort of lost its way in the world. And one of the things, of course, to keep in mind is that religious groups like the Moral Majority became more involved and more organized in politics. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on Tuesday when I cover the Ronald Reagan era here when we get to that. So to debrief very quickly, why did conservatism grow? Sense that the national government had grown too powerful is one reason. Belief that laissez-faire is more effective than government programs, or reaction against things like the Great Society and the New Deal. Some Americans felt social programs did not benefit them. Remember our famous example of the woman whose typewriter was stolen from the documents. Belief that young people were straying too far away from traditional values and or religion. So we saw some examples of that in the documents for sure. Sense that American power in the world was slipping. Opposition to the feminist movement specifically. We saw examples of that with the Terry Holt document. Less trust in government officials. Hopefully you remember the Watergate story, the inability to deal with economic problems of the federal government in the 1970s. And for the exam practice, we're going to actually move this because we're running short on time. We'll do this next week for sure with you guys. So remember, if you know anybody that's having trouble with internet access or accessing a device, please send them to cb.org/tech. That way they can get some help with that situation. Obviously, the exam being online, we want to make sure everybody has the access that they're going to need to be successful there. With that, thanks for watching. Just a handful of other names here: Stephanie Benjamin from Franklin High School, Vanessa Sanchez, Hanford West High School, Tahia from Valley Stream Central High School, Liliana Arias from Skinny Atlas High School. My school's hockey team actually played their hockey team this year. That's why I know how to pronounce that. Vanessa Peralta, Hanford West High School. Angie Gadudo, Oswego East High School. I think hopefully I said that one correctly. Sarah from Liberty High School. Chloe Presley from Hilton High School. Makeup Holly Springs High School. Jim Morrison from Red Wing High School. Shu Yi from Pioneer High School. Jay from South Central High School. Ava Kuntz from Orange County School of Arts, and Nikki Modi from Thompson High School. All those are students that have tuned in every single day this week. We really appreciate you doing that. Please spread the word that we're going to continue doing this next week. We're going to wrap up the course for you, and then review begins the week after that. But next week, we're still going to be focusing on those skills that will help you be successful on DBQ type questions. So your question for tomorrow, for Monday rather, excuse me, it's the weekend, is to explain relevant and insightful connections within period 8 and across period 8 to other periods. So over the weekend, think about how does all this stuff tie together within period 8. We started with Truman and the early Cold War, and we went through the Civil Rights Movement, and we talked about the Vietnam War and the change in the federal government's role in the economy with the Great Society program. Think about all those things. What's the connecting threads that you can identify in those? And Ms. Farr will be back on Monday to talk through and to deal with most of those with you. So thanks again for tuning in, and hopefully we'll see you next Monday right here at 11 a.m. Have a great weekend, everybody.